Hello everybody, my name is Arstall and I stream Magic the Gathering Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. I just wanted to say it's been an absolute gift that you have been enjoying my videos. Every week I will be publishing a drafting guide for a different archetype, and today we'll be covering the best cards for drafting Selesnya, or green-white, in Brothers War. Before I dive into the cards, I'd like to acknowledge that there are several ways to approach an archetype. I'm going to be covering my preferred approach, which is largely based around the gratuitous number of cheap flyers that are available in white. So it ends up being very similar to Azorius or blue-white soldiers, and instead of the uncommon and rare gold cards, you play undervalued green commons. Speaking of which, my top common for Selesnya is Gaia's Gift. I talked about how underappreciated this card is in my guide to Gruul, and this card wheels. And in the deck that I'm trying to build for Selesnya, I'm aiming to get 3 or 4. So, Azorius has Loren's Escape, but in Selesnya and access to green, this is just a better option to protect a flyer from removal, and it gets a +1/+1 counter. The next common I'm looking to grab as many as I can get is Scrapwork Cohort. Green has access to Power Stones, so you can usually cast this for a discounted cost, and with my approach to Selesnya, if this isn't applying enough pressure by going wide, it still does an excellent job of gumming up the ground while I finish my opponent off in the air. Speaking of flying and going wide, Ambush Paratrooper is still going super late. I wouldn't expect this card to wheel, but I still see these sitting around pick 5 or pick 6. It flies, it pumps all of your little soldier tokens when you're going wide, and similarly to Boros, it offers a late game mana sink to utilize your Power Stones. Next up we have Aeronaut Cavalry. As I mentioned, this is basically the Azorius soldier shell, and this is a great flying soldier. Prison Sentence was my number 1 common for both Boros, red-white, and Azorius, blue-white. I've found it to be a little less powerful in Selesnya for 2 reasons. First, Gaia's Gift tends to be a more versatile card that sort of counts as removal in the form of a combat trick, but it can also be used defensively. Secondly, I find myself using Prison Sentence a little bit later to remove a flyer I can't get over with Gaia's Gift, like Aeronaut Cavalry, for example. So I don't benefit as much from the turn 3 Scry 2. I tend to pick up the white commons going for Boros or Azorius, and then shuffle over to Selesnya when I feel like the colors are contested. Like I'm not seeing the Azorius gold cards or Excavation Explosion in red. So I have usually already picked up 1 or 2 of these, and I still think it's better than filler, but it's worth noting that it performs a little worse in Selesnya than it does in Boros or Azorius. Airlift Chaplain is part of the gratuitous number of cheap common white flyers and is more than welcome in my Selesnya deck. However, this is where you really want to start paying attention to your approach to Selesnya. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are multiple ways to draft an archetype, and this card benefits from having a deck that is low to the ground. And by that I mean mostly 3 drops or lower. So if you have mostly 3 drops or lower, this card can replace itself easily. However, there is a green common that I think tempts a lot of players into a different path, and that is Argothian Opportunist, the Darth Vader of green. I think this card was on everybody's radar early in the set when we all thought it was going to be about who gets to play the big artifact creatures first. And it's still getting picked up super early, so it's always tempting to grab one when you see it. My preference, if I have a bunch of Argothian Opportunists, is to be in Golgari, where the Power Stones help you ramp to big beefy green creatures like Boulder Branch Golem. But in Selesnya, I prefer more of a tempo strategy based off of flyers, and it's worth noting that Scrapwork Cohort, Ambush Paratrooper, and Aeronaut's Wings are really the only 3 commons that I'm trying to run that really benefit from Power Stones. So there are plenty of good uncommons and rares that are colorless that we'll get into, but I just want to emphasize that I think this is the card that lowers the win rate of Selesnya for a lot of players because they get tempted into playing big artifact creatures. Blanchwood Prowler is another card that you need to take inventory of what other cards in your deck synergize with it. It gets better the more unearthed cards you have. If you aren't running any, or if you aren't running many, I think it is closer to filler, but I've still found it useful to smooth out your early draws. Many people curse the shuffler when they get stuck on 2 lands instead of including cards like this or Scrapwork Mutt to help improve your mana curve. My last common is Aeronaut's Wings. This works nicely with cards like Argothian Opportunist, which attack poorly as a 3/2, but as a 4/2 flyer with Gaia's Gift in hand to protect your equipped creature, it fits perfectly into the flying tempo strategy. Now for the uncommons. As I mentioned in my previous guides, Static Net is a mythic level uncommon. Its worst performing white archetype is Orsov because you already have so much access to removal. But even then, it's still a great card that I'm going to include. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, if you are in white, run this card. It doesn't just remove creatures, it can target non-land permanents, it gains you 2 life, and it ramps by creating a Power Stone. I will take as many of these as I can get, and I'm happy to pack one, pick one this. Now for my next tier down, tier 1 uncommons, Recruitment Officer is a great white uncommon. I think it's less important as a 2/1 for 1 compared to Boros, for example, but similar to Azorius, in Selesnya, its ability is key. Being able to find more flyers later in the game is usually what you need to do to win, and this card does just that. Obstinate Baloth is a great green uncommon. If your deck is mostly white flyers, the 2 double pip green can be difficult to work around, since it would prefer to have 11 sources of green to reliably cast this on turn 4. This is still the most satisfying card to slam on turn 4, and it can apply a lot of pressure with Gaia's Gift to make it a 5/5 trample on turn 5. Since I'm building most of my deck to be low to the ground at 3 cost or less, I don't find it too surprising that Hero of the Dunes performs really well in Selesnya. It's obviously worse if you get tempted into playing a bigger curve, looking at you, Argothian Opportunist, but returning a cheap flyer and giving all of your small creatures +1/+0 is worth the splash. And it isn't too hard to splash in green. You can pick up a couple of Sentinel Stalwarts, the 1/1s that can tap it and something else to create a mana, Evolving Wilds, or some cheap artifact fixing to hit your 4 sources of black, which is what I recommend for splashing 1 to 3 cards. Combat Thresher is your bread and butter white uncommon. It will be in every guide that has white, because if you can play this for 3 for its prototype cost, it's great. 3 cost creatures that draw a card have been great in Limited, and this card is no exception. It also works quite nicely with Aeronaut's Wings, where you can, attack with a 2/1 flying double strike on turn 4, and it applies a lot of pressure. Mask of the Jadecrafter, as I mentioned in my guides to Gruul and Golgari, is a great mid-range value card. It doesn't fit the flying tempo strategy perfectly, but it gives you so much value, I can't pass this up. Usually you get 2 5/5s or 6/6s out of 1 card. Ashnod's Harvester is also worth a mention, even though you might not be able to pay for its unearth cost. It is early pressure, and this card, most importantly, answers self-mill and unearth strategies. It's best in Boros, but it's still a great card in Selesnya, and if you're splashing for Hero of the Dunes, you get the bonus of being able to unearth it. Self-Assembler is more of a mid-range card, and I mentioned it in my guide to Gruul. I think it's most at home in Gruul, but it's still worth including if you can get 2 or 3 of them. It tends to go late, and it does synergize with Power Stone strategies. It's kind of my backup plan if the white flyers dry up in pack 2 and 3, and I need to go for more of a mid-range strategy. The last uncommon that I think is worth a mention is Fortified Vanguard. It pairs nicely with cards like Scrapwork Cohort to give you your cheap flyers a boost in damage. I mentioned it as a potential splash back in my Azorius guide, but now that we're a little further into the set, I think splashing in Azorius is detrimental to the overall power level of the deck, but it's easier to splash in Selesnya because of cards like Sentinel Stalwart. It's still best in Boros, but if you've already picked up mana fixing, it can be a decent inclusion. So to put it in another way, if I can pick up Hero of the Dunes early, I will, and then find the fixing. But I'd rather already have the fixing before picking up Fortified Vanguard. Now for the rares. I can confidently say that Titania's Command is the best rare in the set. It is a broken card. Every guide with green will have it. The 4 double pip green does want 9 sources of green to reliably cast it, which at least means that this card isn't being splashed into every deck. Almost every time you'll create 2/2/2 bear tokens and then give your whole board permanent +2/+2 counters. So on an empty board, you're playing an 8/8 worth of value for 6 that just gets better the more that your board is developed. I've mentioned Steel Seraph in other guides, but it is worth noting that it performs the best in Selesnya. It is definitely a tier S rare. It fits the flying tempo strategy perfectly. Sometimes you can afford to pay it for its prototype cost at 1 and double pip white, since I tend to build a mostly white Selesnya deck. And you'll have Power Stones potentially to ramp this card out. Siege Veteran is also a broken card. Every guide with white will have it. It's better the earlier that you play it, so it tends to that tends to keep it from being splashed into every deck. But it's a Luminarch Aspirant for 3 that can spawn 1/1 soldiers and pairs well with other soldier synergies. It needs to be answered with removal, or you just snowball the game out of control. I'm stealing so much from the Azorius strategy that I'm even going to steal its rares. You could splash for, you should definitely splash for Sky Strike Officer. As I've mentioned, it's easy to splash in Selesnya, and you don't need this card to come down on turn 3. If you've been tempted to the dark side by Argothian Opportunists to ramp into big artifacts, this splash doesn't make the most sense, but if you followed this guide and you're running Selesnya as a backup when Azorius is too contested, you can see why this card should be included. Simian Simulacrum is better in Gruul, where you have more reliable access, more cards that give you Power Stones, and you can usually more reliably cast its Unearth cost, since I suggest being mostly white in Selesnya, but it's definitely still worth a mention. I mean, let's be honest, this card goes into every archetype. My last Tier 1 rare is Lauren of the Third Path. A 2/1 for 3 with a built-in Disenchant is great in a set where Disenchant is main boardable. And now I'm going to skip a bunch of rares and talk about the ones that stand out specifically to Selesnya, but I'll give the others a brief mention just in case. Autonomous Assembler, Precursor Golem, Teething Wormlet, Phyrexian Dragon Engine, and Maze Mind Tome are all great to include. Basically, if it benefits off of Power Stone synergies, throw it in. Key to the City is a card that benefits off of Power Stones, and I'll happily include it in Boros and Selesnya. Being able to make one of your creatures unblockable can be that last little bit of reach that you really need to close out the game. Fortified Beachhead is worth a mention. I think it's clearly designed for the Selesnya deck that is running all of the white soldier synergies and wants to splash blue for something like Sky Strike Officer. Interestingly, it performs better in Selesnya than it does in Azorius, and I think it makes sense. The mana sink ability is an inferior version to Ambush Paratrooper. So really, it mostly functions as a dual land, which always helps the splash more than it does the main colors. Now, here is a rare that I would only play in Selesnya, and only in a specific type of Selesnya. Remember how I said at the beginning of the guide that there are multiple ways to approach an archetype? Well, if you don't want to be a budget version of Azorius, the archetype's actual theme is Artifact Fall, where you benefit from an artifact coming into play. And this card works really nicely in that strategy alongside Yotian Dissident. If you go for the actual theme of Artifact Fall and Selesnya, then you need to grab as many Dissidents as you can. And then you just fill your deck with as many cheap artifacts and artifact creatures. And Dissident tends to get taken early. And in general, I've found the flying strategy to be better and more reliable to draft. But I'd be damned for not mentioning it in a guide to Selesnya, but you never know. You might pack one, pick one scrap trawler and decide to be brave. Or you might be being passed like 4 dissidents, right? And then you can actually go for the archetypes theme. Platoon Dispenser is a mythic that goes in a lot of decks. It is worth mentioning, though, it performs best in Selesnya. If you are mostly white, you can afford its unearth cost, and even just as a 5-cost 4/6 that can draw multiple cards, it's great. And you can also ramp to it with Power Stones, which makes it, I think, the perfect fit for Selesnya. Since we've stolen Azorius' rares, why not continue with the mythics? Myrel, Shield of Argive, is a great card in any deck with soldiers. A 3/4 for 4 that makes it so your opponent can't play spells or activate abilities on your turn is great, and more important, she creates at least one 1/1 soldier every time she attacks. And similar to Azorius, she usually creates more than one in Selesnya. Now, I'm going to skip some mythics and just give them a brief mention. Cityscape Leveler, Portal to Phyrexia, and Wormcoil Engine are great if you've been tempted by the dark side and want to ramp to big beefy artifacts. They typically take me to other archetypes if I pack one, pick one them. So similarly, in the Trenches, Rootwire Amalgam, and Awaken the Woods are all good inclusions as well, but they all have a better archetype outside of Selesnya. So Clay Champion, though, is a mythic I only recommend playing in Selesnya. Its white enter the battlefield effect, I think, is better than its green. It's usually better to spread the counters out among your creatures instead of just playing it as a big creature. But, don't discount playing this as a really massive creature late in the game. So, thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Selesnya. Remember to hit like and subscribe to help support me. I really do appreciate it. You can also catch me Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. And if you have a specific archetype you'd like to see, let me know. We only have 4 archetypes left, and then it will be time for All Will Be One, available on Magic the Gathering Arena February 7th. So thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.